Hi everyone. I'll be introducing Ed in a second, but I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands where we meet today. So in Brisbane, that's the Turrbal and Jagera people. And now we have Dr. Eduardo Gallo Cajiao speaking for us today. He's an assistant professor at Colorado State University. He's very interested in migratory species conservation. And he actually did his PhD at UQ, working with Rich Fuller, Tiffany Morrison, and Sally Clark. And today he's going to be talking to us about the governance of migratory shorebirds and their conservation in the Americas. So, all right, if you're happy to go ahead. Can you see us? You can kind of see me there, but you do have a room full of people listening as well.
I see you. Great, thank you. So you can hear me and see me properly?
Yes.
Okay, great. So am I ready? Am I good to go?
Yeah.
Excellent. So yeah, so I guess good morning here to everyone in Brisbane. So thank you very much again for the invite to give this seminar and to share, I guess, what I've been up to regarding migratory shorebird conservation since I left UQ a few years ago, where I did my PhD looking at the governance of shorebird conservation in the Asia Pacific, an area of a lot of interest to quite a few people at UQ, and particularly, of course, a strong interest of Professor Richard Fuller. So I went to do a postdoc at the, give me a second, see if this changes. Yeah, at the University of Washington, Smith Fellowship, and looking at quite similar questions in some ways to what I had done in my PhD in some ways, but now looking at the case of the Americas flyways as another study system to understanding the emergence and the different dynamics of environmental governance when it comes to migratory shorebirds. So migratory shorebirds, give or take, around 200 species that are migratory, that occur all around the world. And they undertake long-distance migrations, probably some of the longest in the animal world, especially amongst birds and, of course, amongst vertebrates, some of the longest, breeding typically at very high latitudes in the northern hemisphere, and migrating south to the opposite sides of the world, if you will, in different parts of the world. So in the case of the Asia Pacific, the area of a strong interest for conservationists and conservation scientists at UQ is the Asia Pacific, or so-called East Asian Australasian flyway, and that's the place where I did my PhD. But now I've been looking at the case of the Americas as another study system. So more countries, quite similar number of species, around 45 species of migratory shorebirds, more or less doing similar things, breeding at high latitudes across Canada primarily, and to a lesser extent across Alaska and a little bit in Northeast Russia, and migrating south throughout Central America all the way to even Tierra del Fuego, Chiloé Island, as an example, in the case of Hudsonian godwits, some of the longest migrations undertaken by migratory shorebirds in this part of the world. And similarly to the case of the East Asian Australasian flyway, populations have been declining, but that's, of course, beyond the purview of the research that I've been doing. So we're going to be talking about considering the governance for conserving migratory shorebirds and understanding how these international or transboundary migrations require governance mechanisms to address the issues that are inherent, that are implicit to cross-jurisdictional fragmentation. Then governance then provides a good lens to understand the different mechanisms used by various actors across their landscapes, through which they enable collaboration and coordination to precisely address those issues of jurisdictional fragmentation. And then when we are talking about institutions, basically we are talking about institutions not in the sense of understanding as stakeholders or as organizations, but from a more governance and political science perspective, understood as institutions, basically, and that's just the rules of the game, whether they are formal or informal. That's a different story, but in a nutshell, they are just understood as rules. And now I'm going to be telling you three main research questions that I've been focusing on in the case of this part of the world when it comes to migratory shorebirds and their governance for their conservation. And one of them is the emergence of the system of conserving migratory shorebirds from a governance perspective in the Western Hemisphere or the Americas, as we can also refer to this region too. And basically, what I'm talking about here is that usually when we think about the migratory, the conservation of migratory shorebirds, basically, we are not talking about one single institutional arrangement, and we're talking about governance systems. We're talking about a suite and a set of multiple institutional arrangements. They are very large areas through which they undertake their migrations, and that means that having single institutional arrangements is fairly impossible. And if you were to think about the case of climate change as a parallel, and you think about the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that is probably one of the central and most important agreements within the system of governance for climate change, but it's not the only one. And there are many other places where governance takes place in the space of climate change mitigation and adaptation. And we're thinking about those parallels to migratory shorebird conservation. It happens very similarly. So now we're going to think about then the question is, how has the governance system for conserving migratory shorebirds in the Western Hemisphere of the Americas has emerged over time? And secondly, what explains that institutional multiplicity and diversity? What explains that we have multiple institutional arrangements rather than only a single one? And what explains that diversity? The fact that they accomplish different things. They have different functions. So the first step that I did was basically to identify all the various institutional arrangements with a stake in shorebird conservation across the Americas. And this is just to show you a visualization that is not comprehensive, but it's just to conceptualize what I'm talking about here. In total, what I found, or what we found, because it was a collaborative project as part of my fellowship, was that there are 30 institutional arrangements in this part of the world. And the central one of all is the so-called Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. There are many others, such as, for instance, the Ramsar Convention, the Convention on Migratory Species, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and many others that are way more specialized, such as, for instance, the Pacific Shorebird Conservation Initiative, a small network of protected areas for wetlands in the Austral Patagonia, in southern Chile and southern Argentina. This is just to show you an example of those multiple institutional arrangements, which is, they amount to 30 in total. And now we're going to think about what they are doing functionally. Then what is very interesting is to understand that when we are thinking about migratory shorebird conservation, basically migratory shorebird conservation from a governance perspective, institutionally really, is at the intersection of three main policy areas. So one is wetland conservation, agreements such as the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, grassland conservation, agreements or arrangements such as the Grassland Alliance in South America for the protection of the Pampas grasslands across Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. And then migratory species conservation more broadly, such as the case of the Convention on Migratory Species. And what is interesting is then to think about that very few agreements are actually the exclusive purview of have a specific focus and exclusive focus migratory shorebird. Migratory shorebirds are just honing and part of other arrangements that involve other issue areas. So we're going to think about the emergence of this system of institutional arrangements. If we're going to think about that there are 30 in total, we start thinking about, well, how have they emerged over time? And basically, this system started emerging in the early 1900s, and this is in a stark contrast with the case of the Asia Pacific, where the system started emerging in the 1970s. So this system is probably one of the oldest and longest running anywhere in the world when it comes to migratory shorebird conservation. And of course, it had a very high increase of agreements around the 1980s and 1990s. Importantly and interestingly, without the participation of key countries in some of those agreements that are very important for migratory shorebird conservation. I'm talking about the Convention on Biological Diversity in the case of the US, which is a non-party. In the case of the Convention on Migratory Species, which also include the US, Canada, and Mexico as non-parties to that convention. So now this is a network representation of those intergovernmental agreements within the region and how they are connected with one another in relation to institutional arrangements. So the IAs symbolize institutional arrangements or agreements of some sort, and the other ones are self-explanatory. They are countries. And what we see basically is that the US, Canada, and Mexico basically are set aside in terms of the network. They belong to particular institutional arrangements that are not widely shared with many of the other countries across the region. And interesting and importantly too, countries in South and South America, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay belong to one institutional arrangement also that sets them apart from the rest. And all the other ones are more or less connected by highly centralized institutional arrangements that have very large memberships across the region. And this is the visual representation of the spatial distribution of the density or number of institutional arrangements to which each country has signed to in the region, or that is a party to. And the darker the color, the more the agreements, and the lighter, the fewer. And basically what we see here basically is that, yes, unsurprisingly, the US and Canada are the countries that have signed the most agreements in the region. And then importantly, we're going to think about the diversity of institutional arrangements or agreements in terms of the composition of the type of membership that they have. So a little bit, just over half of them are actually, strictly speaking, intergovernmental, whereas the rest of them, basically the other half more or less, is actually divided in between those agreements that include multi-actor or hybrid, so-called hybrid memberships, agreements that include a state as well as non-state actors. And then lastly, the ones with the fewest representation in the region are agreements that are exclusively that have members as membership exclusively non-state actors. And this is the case, for instance, of the Grassland Alliance, again, as the same example in South and South America, that involves only NGOs as the members of such agreement. So just to sum up this first question, as to answer the first question, so the Western Hemisphere governance system predates that from the East Asian Australasian Flyway, and we want to think about basically how it has emerged. So it has emerged basically temporarily since the early 1900s. And in terms of what explains that institutional multiplicity and diversity, that is likely the result of incremental problem definition, political coalitions given by interests beyond environmental concerns, divergent political preferences for problem solving through specific institutional arrangements, and insufficiency of institutional arrangements. Basically, it's the very increased demand for conserving this species that is being, or that is outpacing the supply of institutions that is leading, or that has been leading, more and more development of more agreements throughout the region. And now we're going to move to the second question that I'm going to be sharing with you today. And these are all preliminary results, so none of these is published yet. And the question is, well, what about if we start like zooming in and understanding the history and the emergence of particular agreements? And let's remember that we are talking about the relationship between supply and demand. If we're going to understand institutions from this economic approach, then we could think about that if there is a supply and demand of institutions, then it follows basically that we don't take institutions for granted, basically. So which means we can actually try to understand why they emerge, how they emerge, and why they emerge in particular ways, why agreements look the way they do and not in a different way, and why sometimes agreements, despite the increased need for them to emerge, have not emerged. Well, this basically takes us to the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, the most important agreement in the region for shorebird conservation, which importantly is exclusively focused on migratory shorebirds. So we addressed 3 questions, and it was a collaboration with a colleague, with a professor from Rutgers University, Jenny Isaacs, and 2 students, Jesse McLaughlin and Hale Oal. So the 3 questions was, what is the history of WHISRN, or the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, about in relation to how it came about, how it came to be? The second is what motivated the development of WHISRN, and the third one, which factors shape the formality and design of Western. So basically, why Western looks the way it does. So the case study, this is a case study, and this is the case of Western. For some of you that may be familiar with the Ramsar Convention or the East Asian Australasian Flyweight Partnership, basically what we have is that this agreement is multi-actor and is completely focused on the Western Hemisphere. And all the dots that we see here basically represent sites that are important for migratory shorebirds throughout their life cycle that have been recognized and officially designated as part of the network that receive or confer some degree of protection. So the case study is the history of the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. When we are thinking about, if we are thinking about the formality, and that's what we are trying to explain, well, the formality of Western is actually informal, so it's non-legally binding, and is multi-actor. And lastly, the design of Western is focused on habitat conservation at a site level. It's not basically concerned with many other threats, for instance, such as hunting. So we understood or we analyzed the history as on how it came about in relation to particular contexts that we believe are very important to understanding the emergence of this particular agreement. And the first one is the scientific context for North Americans. This was an agreement that was created by North Americans. And understanding this means we need to understand how North Americans got to understand the migration of migratory shorebirds. So importantly, 1928 was a landmark paper published by Alexander Wedmore on how migratory shorebirds were using the southern grasslands of South America as part of their annual cycle of the life cycle for shorebirds that were breeding in northern Canada and northern US. Then in 1974 to the present, the International Shorebird Survey has been led by Manomet out of Massachusetts, Manomet Bird Observatory, now Manomet Conservation Science, and they are still running this International Shorebird Survey with the collaboration of many local NGOs and researchers across the region. And between 1982 and 1986, there was a series of aerial surveys led by Morrison and Ross as part of an effort of the Canadian Wildlife Service. So all these allow us to understand the migration patterns of migratory shorebirds throughout the Americas. And again, same as we don't take institutions for granted, we don't take our understanding of migrations for granted. It has taken a long time and a lot of effort to understand and unveil their migratory cycles. And this has been the basis for the development of such institutional arrangements. From an institutional perspective, what was important was to understand, well, what other agreements have been developed over time before and alongside the development of the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. Well, in 1916, the US and Canada entered what is considered now a landmark agreement specifically for migratory bird conservation, the so-called 1916 Migratory Bird Treaty, or MBT. In 1936, the US enters a similar agreement with Mexico. In 1940, most countries from across the region in the Americas entered the so-called Western Hemisphere Convention on Nature. This is not to be confused with the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. 1971 is the signing of the Ramsar Convention, and 1979 is the signing of the Convention on Migratory Species. What I have here on the map is I'm just sharing the countries that were parties to the Convention on Migratory Species back in 1985, the year when the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network was launched. 1985. In 1985, the only country that was a party to the Convention on Migratory Species in the region was Chile. And this is just for us to start thinking about that relationship of supply and demand and how that need for conserving migratory shorebirds will not be matched by any of the existing institutional arrangements. When we think about that, the first two agreements were bilateral and focused only on North America, and that the 1940 Western Hemisphere Convention on Nature, unfortunately, became, in a way, a so-called sleepy treaty, basically, an agreement that never really took off operationally throughout the region, or at least not to the extent that it could help advance migratory shorebird conservation. Now, lastly, how the actually process led to the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. In 1982, the Western concept is presented to the International Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies by a group of different so-called governance entrepreneurs, many of them biologists that were dedicated and invested heavily in shorebird conservation. They did that with institutional support or organizational support, I would say, from WWF, the Academy of Natural Sciences, and the New Jersey Department of Fish and Wildlife. That was presented to the International Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which eventually in 1985 passed it as a resolution for the establishment, the official establishment of the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. In 1986, the very first reserve is inscribed as part of the network, and this was Delaware Bay, which is a very important site for the northern migration, the spring migration of the Rufa subspecies of red knots. And then the rest is history with over 100 sites that we already saw on the map earlier in the presentation. So next year is the 40th anniversary of the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. Now, what motivated the development of WISRN? Well, on the one hand, it's important to understand that governance entrepreneurs, individuals with organizational support play a very important role in the development of this initiative. Scientific knowledge about shorebird migration underpin problem definition very importantly, and threats such as oil spills in the Gulf of Alaska and what happened with the Exxon Valdez oil spill play a very important role in our understanding or in our thinking about the potential catastrophic event of pollution or habitat loss or habitat degradation in places that were tremendously important within the network of migration. And that's the case, for instance, of the Copper River Delta in the upper Gulf of Alaska. And lastly, that support from key organizations such as NGOs and state wildlife agencies was central to the process. Now, which factors shape the formality and design of WISRN? So basically, we are going to understand that these departed from the traditional intergovernmental agreement that is very similar to, for instance, the Ramsar Convention and the Convention on Biological Diversity, or even the Convention on Migratory Species. Then what led governance entrepreneurs and what led all the different players to eventually land in a place that was very different from anything else? And through a series of interviews and document analysis, basically what we discovered was that most of the reasons were related to mistrust in traditional intergovernmental processes, particularly as it pertains to implementation. Basically, they were trying, in common parlance, I would say, basically, they were trying to cut the middleman of implementation. So they wanted to create a network that was highly decentralized, that would engage directly, site-level management, and that would cut out of the equation all the various layers of government, basically, between national governments and local sites. In addition to that, the interviews also allow us to identify that there was, at the time, a perceived insufficiency of seemingly relevant existing institutional arrangements. And we are talking about the Ramsar Convention and the Western Convention for the Conservation of Nature. And in terms of the design, the main concern for the design of this agreement was habitat retention. And that's in a stark contrast with the agreement signed early in the 1900s, which were almost exclusively focused on hunting. So hunting many decades later was not perceived or was not considered to be, or perhaps it wasn't really a major driver for population declines, but habitat loss and habitat degradation was being understood and perceived as one of the main reasons for population declines. So the take-home messages from this second research question, that the golden era of traditional intergovernmental treaty making is considered to be the 1990s, after which an emergence of alternate transboundary governance models, such as WISRN, emerged due to perceived governance deficits. What is interesting is that against this backdrop, WISRN represents, to the best of our knowledge, an early case of transboundary governance departing from the traditional intergovernmental treaty model. Hence, WISRN can be considered as a case of institutional innovation that was already denoting governance deficiencies for conserving a group of animals with relatively low political saliency. And what is very interesting is that WISRN became the model and the template for the development of what is the underpinning of the backbone of the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership in the Asia Pacific. So there was eventually, after 1985 and getting into the 1990s, it was actually a process of policy diffusion. And when the system was being developed for shorebird conservation in the Asia Pacific, they looked at the case of the Americas, and that model was taken in many ways to be emulated in the Asia Pacific. And lastly, we are going to talk and consider the importance of all these systems of institutional arrangement. They are only as good as they are actually translated into action on the ground. And that takes us, of course, to the very important question of implementation. And this was an analysis of the implementation of migratory shorebird conservation plans in the Puget Sound region in the Pacific Northwest, in the upper coast of the upper western coast of the contiguous US. And it was a capstone project conducted by led by two students at the University of Washington, Molly Daly and Ellie Donnelly. And we were basically, invested in answering three questions. That's how we operationalized the evaluation of implementation of those conservation plans. So the first one was, how aware were key informants understood as conservation practitioners in a particular part or particular estuary within the Puget Sound? How aware were land managers basically of the conservation plans? Secondly, how were the conservation plans being included, if at all, in actual internal documents of those key land management organizations in the region, in terms of to what degree they were incorporating explicitly the principles and the actions laid out by these conservation plans? And lastly, to what degree actions on the ground, as on like the management of that particular site, were actually being informed by any of the conservation plans? And at the end of the day, this question takes us to our ever-present puzzle or quest for understanding to what degree any of these institutional arrangements that we are all the time, when we are thinking about conservation and we develop plans and we develop agreements, well, to what degree they matter at the end of the day, to what degree they are actually making a difference ultimately on the ground. And that was basically the rationale or the intention for addressing this question. So this is Skagit Bay, which is the area where the project focused on, and that's just on the Puget Sound coast, just north of Seattle. Number 14 here on the map is the Skagit estuary. That place is very important for many migratory shorebirds on migration, both northwards and southwards, but in particular to Danlin during winter and to Western Sandpiper during the northward migration. So the three conservation plans that we looked at for implementation was the Pacific Americas Shorebird Conservation Strategy, considered to be taken as an international conservation plan that focuses across the entire Pacific coast of the Americas, including the US, of course. The National Shorebird Conservation Plan that covers the entire US. And lastly, the Regional Northern Pacific Regional Shorebird Management Plan. The take-home messages from this analysis basically is that when we consider the three questions, the first one, to what degree land managers with boots on the ground, or so-called bush level or street level bureaucrats, to what degree those people with boots on the ground are actually aware of any of these three conservation plans? I'm not presenting here statistics. I saved those for later, basically, and I decided just to focus on the very general overarching patterns. And basically, a very superficial understanding and awareness of those agreements is what we found across the board when many people were interviewed. Many of those people who have boots on the ground when it comes to the management of those sites. So they are aware that they exist, but they don't have a profound understanding of those conservation plans. And what is interesting is that most of the people that were aware of those conservation plans use those conservation plans not necessarily to guide their decision making, but to legitimize or to justify looking for funding, basically. Funding that was sought through or from government agencies, particularly the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and how mentioning these conservation plans basically creates a mandate, so to speak, or legitimizes basically funding. The second one, which is the inclusion of the conservation plans, how they are integrated into management plans of the area of Skagit Bay or the Skagit Estuary. What we found is that out of 11 documents that are concerned with management for the site, only one has a specific mention to these conservation plans. And lastly, to what degree actions on the ground by any of these, by people with boots on the ground, is actually being driven or informed or inspired by the actual conservation plans. And what we found basically is that many actors, many organizations are actually rolling out and are implementing actions on the ground that have the potential, either implicitly or explicitly, to benefit shorebirds. But very few cases we found of evidence that's being informed by those very conservation plans. So basically what we see in this particular case is that at this point in time, those conservation plans basically have very little additionality when it comes to the conservation of that particular site for migratory shorebirds. So the overall conclusions from today's presentation is that the study of migratory shorebird conservation is a fertile ground for environmental governance scholarship. Advancing research on migratory shorebird conservation governance can provide valuable insights for practice. And lastly, the Americas is a region with a thriving governance system for migratory shorebird conservation, warranting further attention. And with that, I would like to acknowledge the many key collaborators that have been part of this research over the years: Niles Dolzak, Brad Andres, Tejmon Kerr, Nick Davidson, Isadora Angarita, Spike Millington, Jenny Isaacs, Hallowell, Jesse McLaughlin, Molly Daly, and Ellie Donnelly. To many of the key informants that have been actively engaged with these processes, because we have been conducted many interviews for these three main research questions. So to them, a huge thank you. And to the many organizations and institutions that have been part of this process over the years. So with that, I will stop sharing for now. I'm happy to go back if there are any questions that may warrant going back to the presentation, but otherwise I'll stop sharing for now. So thank you very much to everyone for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ed. I'll just check, are there any questions in the room before we check on the chat? No, I had one which I'll start off with. My name's Tina, I'm working here as a postdoc at UQ. I noticed on one of the maps that you had at the beginning of the WISN sites, it was one of the slides you shared after the second set of questions. It looked like the WISN sites were pretty well distributed across North and South America, but there was a very large gap along the east coast of Brazil. And there were sites towards the northeast coast of Brazil, but then it looked like there was nothing along that entire coastline. And I was just wondering if there was a specific reason or, why that's the case.
That is a very good question. I guess there are two parts to answer that question. One is the distribution, the intrinsic distribution of the most important sites for migratory shorebirds in South America. And the second one is the degree to which politically it has been possible to designate the important sites under the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Research Network. So to the first one, I don't have myself an absolute detailed knowledge of the distribution of those important sites, because the inscription of sites under the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Research Network happens under thresholds of abundance, very similar to the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership of the Ramsar Convention. And based on the work of Morrison and back in the 1980s, which they did using aerial surveys across the entire or along the entire coast of South America. When it comes to Brazil, really the most important sites in terms of concentration really is that northern part, as you mentioned, and Lagoa de Peixe in southern Brazil, in Rio Grande do Sul, close to Porto Alegre. That, I guess, would answer part of the question, and that is, of course, related to the distribution of intertidal flats, basically, which are typically associated with river systems and large river systems, basically. So in terms of the degree to which important sites may have still lagging in terms of the designation. Yes, for instance, just to give you an example, in Colombia politically, I know that there has been a hiatus. The government basically, after the designation of 2 sites, has decided that they won't engage any longer with the designation of any additional sites. So even though Colombia may still have a few more sites up for designation, without the backing of the national government, it will be very hard to make them happen. So I guess, yeah, there are 2 parts of one is the intrinsic distribution of the sites. The second one is the political backing to be able to designate them. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. Does anyone in the
Thank
room have any questions? No, I think that's a question online.
There's a question online. Ed, this is from Gianni Lai. Thank you, Ed, for this amazing presentation. My question is, do you think there is any aspects or topics that WISHN and the East Asia Pacific Flyway can partner together?
This is a perennial question, and that's something that I think. I mean, there are 3 main governance systems at the end of the day. 3 out of the 5 main global flyways for migratory shorebirds. 3 of those flyways have very clear frameworks with very clear central agreements, and that's the case of Africa Eurasia with the so-called AWA, the African Agreement for Waterbird Conservation. Then the case of the EAFP, or East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership in the Asia Pacific, and WISRN in the Americas. For a long time, there have been efforts to create an interflyway network because it is perceived as having multiple benefits, to be able to share stories across regions, to share capacities, to share experiences, to potentially streamline processes across regions. But I believe that's something that empirical is that the problem is capacity, basically. So everybody is so busy doing the work within their region that they don't have the possibility of having time and energy, basically, to be able to engage with other flyways. So there is currently an effort to create that system across flyways, not just across the EAFP and WISRN. But I know that has taken a while, and I know Rich and Tatsuya may have more to share about it. Recently, I actually presented part of this work at the Hemispheric Council meeting of WISRN in Manomet in Massachusetts, and they were actually very interested in understanding not just the research that I've been doing here in the Americas, but also my PhD research as on how much they could learn potentially from how the Asia Pacific is operating and how they could bring that as an example to further advance shorebird conservation in the Americas. We are talking about the possibility of having a small delegation. I'm not really officially part of WISRN. Nevertheless, I'm talking about in plural here, first person plural, and we are talking about the possibility of having a small delegation from WISRN attending the next EAFP MOP in the Philippines next year as a way to start creating that engagement and bridging that gap across those 2 flyways. So yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? I think that's it for questions.
Oh, no, there's one more.
Sorry, there's one more.
Rich is wanting to unmute and ask directly. Go ahead, Rich.
Hi, thanks very much, Ed, for a great talk. Good to see you again. You touched on this several times throughout your presentation, the effectiveness, do these agreements actually create any sort of action that wouldn't have happened without those agreements being in place? And I understand these are difficult questions to get at, and your answers have been, in a way, limited. And I'm keen for your uncensored conclusion. Having studied these agreements so much, do you think they lead to actions that wouldn't have otherwise happened? And even though that may be impossible to quantify, is it worth us really continuing to push international agreements for migratory species conservation Or is it better for each country to just do their own thing and make sure they preserve these birds while they're in their own country?
Yeah, that's the perennial question, Rich. I think that's what brings us together ultimately. So yeah, thank you and great to see you too. I guess to my view, a very interesting case of the Western Hemisphere Convention on the Conservation of Nature signed in the 1940s is how that convention failed to be operationalized or to be implemented internationally from a multilateral perspective, and basically how each country went to do their own thing. So at the end of the day, they were definitely following the mandate of protecting biodiversity, but they were not doing it through a coordinated approach. And that really was a huge shortcoming as it pertains to migratory species conservation, and specifically to migratory shorebirds. So I still believe that there is a lot of value on international cooperation. I believe that thinking about one size fits all solutions or unicorns in the way of having panaceas of agreements that are going to work perfectly, I think we definitely need to, probably think that that's not the way it's going to work. And when it comes to the flyways in this part of the world, in the Americas, what I believe is that more than developing a new agreement or making the ones that already exist somehow more powerful or more legally binding, what I believe is that it's more a matter of orchestration. At the end of the day, the only agreement that really covers or straddles the entire region is the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. Everything else is more or less a patch. It's very patchy and it's focused in various sub-regions across the flyway. And what I believe is that what we need to get better at is at coordinating those smaller agreements or those smaller subsets of governance that is happening across the region. And I believe that that's ultimately, to me, that's the way to go because it's way more adaptable. At the end of the day, migratory shorebird conservation across 50 plus countries, that is the Americas, is not one problem, it's multiple problems. And that means that the problems in South America are very different to the problems in the Caribbean, to the problems in the Pacific Northwest. And that means that having this patch of agreements scattered throughout the region allows for having solutions that are more tailored to particular circumstances. But to answer the question, Rich, I believe that yes, to me, there's still a lot of value. And a testament to that, to me, is that WISERN, against all odds, and being such a tenuous and precarious, I would say, agreement that doesn't have all that backbone of political backing that you get in intergovernmental processes, is celebrating its 40th anniversary. And it has no sign of flagging down, and they keep on, steadily designating and adding more sites. So yeah, I hope that answered part of your question, Rich. But yeah, I think it's a great question.
It does. Wonderful, thanks. And I think sometimes these answers are we can't always show them by data, but you certainly get a good feel for it after so many years of working on it. So thanks for your insight. That's great.
Thanks.
Great. I think that might be all of the questions that everyone has from online and in the room. But I'd just like to say thank you again so much for presenting. It was a great talk. It was very, very interesting. And we were all, pleased to listen to it. So cheers.
Great. Thank you very much. And I hope you next year, at ICCB. So thank you very much. Great to see everyone. Thank you.